Hello, class. Today's video is going to be over proportions, which is the third video from section 6.2. And so the reason that we're doing proportions separate from the regular equations is, they sort of have their own little style. And so I think it's just helpful to kind of treat them as their own. Okay, so we've already been talking about equations. So let's just kind of jump into proportions and then explain it as we go. All right. So what is a proportion? Right. That's a good place to start. So proportion is an equation that is a fraction equals a fraction. And so we've been dealing, last video we dealt with equations that had multiple fractions. And so the big difference between these equations with fractions and a proportion is notice how there are two fractions on this side that are added or subtracted. There's two fractions here. There's two fractions on this side. So anytime you have an add or subtract of multiple terms on one side, it's not a proportion. You could potentially make it a proportion, but by the time you do all that, it's probably quicker to just go ahead and clear the denominator, like we've talked about before. But a proportion is specifically a fraction equals a fraction. And so how do we solve a proportion like this? Well, there is a preferred way to do this. For this first example, I want to show you what happens if we do the same process that we did with problem like 28 and clear the denominator. Just to show you that that can work, okay? And then show you, compare that with the other way, and I think it'll see why we do the other way. All right, so for 29, we're solving x over 33 equals 9/11. All right, so if we were solving this as we had solved, say, 28, our goal would be to multiply everything by the LCD and clear the denominator. Well, as always, start with your biggest denominator. Is it the LCD? Well, 11 does go into 33, so 33 is the smallest number that will both go into. And so to get rid of the fractions, we're going to multiply both sides by the denominator, or sorry, the LCD, which since they're both fractions, I'm going to multiply them by 33 over 1. So 33 is canceled on this side. So that leaves us with x. 11 will go into 33 3 times. So 9 times 3 is 27. And we already have x equals, so we're done. This is a pretty basic equation, even for fractions. And so that clearing the denominator in this case is a very efficient method. The problem is, as we get into messier proportions, this is not always it's not always this efficient. All right. So what's the common method to solve proportions? Now, as I'm sure several of you already been saying, we're going to use the cross product or the cross multiply. Same thing, I'll use those interchangeably. And so this, sometimes students do this for division of fractions, which kind of works. But again, I like to say this for just proportions, because this is where it really applies. And so when we say do the cross product or do the cross multiply, we're multiplying opposite sides of our fractions on those equal signs. Okay? And so the cross product for this particular equation is going to be x times 11, which we write our numbers first. So we would say 11x equals 33 times 9. That is our cross product. The whole reason we do the cross product is we started with the equation, had two fractions, now we have an equation that has no fractions. So just like clearing the denominator for those other equations that had multiple fractions in them, this takes the fractions out of it until possibly the very end. All right, so now once you do the cross product, so that's step one. What do we do next? Well, step two is solve the equation. And how do we do that? Well, as always, our goal is to get x by itself. So to get x by itself, at some point we're going to have to deal with this 11. But over here, we do have a product that we can do. 33 times 9 is 297. So we have 11x equals 297. And so now how do we solve for x? Well, that's 11 times x. So we're going to divide both sides by 11. And guess what? 297 divided by 11 is 27. All right, now, why are we getting the same answer? I want to point out that in the end, we're doing the same math. So to get that 297, we had to do 33 times 9, and then we divided by 11. If you go up here to that first one where we cleared the denominator, guess what? We're doing 9 times 33 divided by 11. So in the end, at some point, we're doing the same math, but whereas this might get messy, the cross product is always going to be these basic steps. You do the cross product, you multiply those two numbers, then you divide by whatever's times your variable. Now that's pretty much it. Always it's not quite that easy, but this cross product method is definitely the way to go with your proportions. All right. And another reason that proportions is helpful, look at number 30. So we have 2/3 equals 3 over x. If you're trying to clear the denominator, what is the LCD? If you're not for sure because the x, well, that's another advantage of the cross product is you don't have to worry about the LCD. We're just going to do the cross product. Now, if you're going on to college algebra, you probably need to recognize that 3, when in doubt with LCDs, multiply the denominators. So 3 times x is the LCD. I don't even know for sure if we always do that in college algebra. If you're going on to trig or calculus, that's the sort of thing you have to be able to do. But again, this is a fraction equals a fraction, so it's a proportion. So just do the cross product. So 2 times x equals 3 times 3. And I know a lot of students, if you can do that multiplication, they don't write it down. But again, for the notes, I'm going to write it out. So 2x equals 9. And so now the one step in left and solving is divided by 2. 9 halves, that is a simplified fraction because 2 won't go into 9. And don't go to a decimal, don't go to mixed number. That is our answer. All right, let's skip 31. That's still pretty basic. Let's look at 32. So we have negative 5/8 equals 10 over x. Okay, so here's the question. What do we do with that negative? Because when we're doing the cross product, that negative is not part of the fraction, it's like outside. Right. This is one of the reasons why we talked about this back when we were doing integers and division. So what do we do with that negative? So here's the question. When we have negative 5/8, is that negative 5 over negative 8? Or is it negative 5 over positive 8? Or is it 5 over negative 8? Okay. Well, if you're thinking the top one, that's the common mistake, and that's one reason we talked about this with integers. So if you have a negative fraction, it is not equal to say, it's not saying both of them are negative, because if you do negative I by negative, you get positive 5/8, but this is a negative 5/8. All right, so if you're solving proportions and you have negative outside of the fraction, typically what we'll do, it doesn't matter in the end if it's in the top or bottom, because negative divided by positive is negative either way. Typically, I like putting the negative in the top. So what I would do here is I would write this as negative 5 over 8 equals 10 over x. Then I think it makes it a little bit more straightforward to do the cross product. It doesn't really matter which side you put the x on, because again, it's an equation. So as long as you have the x on one side, you're good. So we got negative 5x equals 8 times 10. And now we're back to a normal solving process. And then divide both sides by negative 5. We get 1x or x is equal to negative, what is that, 16? Yeah. Okay. So that's how you deal with the negatives. You're dealing with proportions. Because I would put it on the top and then go from there. Okay, so these are all kind of basic proportions. Looking at the handouts, I'm missing one. It's a little bit more involved. So let's go to the homework right after. So in Math Lab, for the proportions homework, I think it's number 16. No, 16 is sort of like one we just did. So for that negative 4/9 that I have, I would make that -4 over +9 and then do the proportion. Okay, but let's look at 17. All right, so 17 and 18 both have a what we call a binomial, two terms up there in a part of the fraction. So what do we do with that? Now your homework 17, 18 is going to look a little bit different than mine, but it's just, different numbers, but it's the same basic setup. So how do we work through this? All right, so we have x minus 1 over 10 equals 4/5. We'll bring the document camera back. Okay, so we have a fraction equals a fraction, so we still have a proportion. We're still doing the cross product. So now the question is, what does that cross product look like? Well, I'll do the easy one first. 10 times 4. I'll just go ahead and say that's 40. So what do we do with this x minus 1 times 5? Okay. Well, that 5 is times the entire thing. So this is where we need parentheses. That's 5 parentheses x minus 1. All right, so how do we solve that equation? Well, hopefully you're looking at that and saying, well, that's a distribution problem, so we need to distribute first. So you had 5 times x and 5 times minus 1. That becomes 5x minus 5 is 40. Now we're back to like that basic core equation that you need to be able to solve for this section. All right, so to get x by itself, first thing we need to do is opposite of subtracting 5, adding 5. 5x equals 45. And then again, the last step is instead of 5 times x, we're going to divide by 5. So we get x equals 9. So we're still doing the cross product. It's just on this. When you have those two terms on that part of the fraction, just put it in parentheses, and then it's a distribution problem. So that makes basically 2 extra steps. 1, you have to distribute, and then 2, you have like an add or subtract that you're going to have to do before you do the division. All right, and again, often these problems will end up as whole number answers, but they could be fractions. So as always, if you do get a fraction as an answer, make sure it is simplified. All right, before we get into the word problems, let me jump back to the homework. In the beginning of the homework, there are some like basic, like how do you set it up type of problems. As always, there's some definitions. I'll let you on those. All right, so here's the ones I was looking. So the ratio of 10 to 40, and it wants us to write the ratio as of whole numbers using fractional notation. And then it says simplified fraction. Okay, so when you're doing a ratio is a fraction that basically they have the same units or no units. And so we want a fraction. So put a fraction bar. And now the question is, what goes where? Okay. So the way this is the first number goes on top. Second number goes on bottom. All right, so now when I check answer, Ooh, I got it incorrect. Why is that incorrect? Well, it's not simplified. All right, so both of those are divisible by 10. So basically can't divide by 10. That makes that 1/4. So again, anytime you're putting in answers a fraction, make sure it's simplified. All right, same sort of idea. Write the following fraction in simplest form. That's 20:6. The way you read that is 22/6. So when you read it, it's actually read just with a 2. Okay. It's just the symbol that gets used sometimes with probability and things. And so that is it's a ratio, so it's a fraction. What goes on top? Well, the first number is 20. What goes on bottom is the second number. Okay. But if I check this is going to be wrong because it's not simplified. So these are both even, so I can divide them both by 2. So 26 becomes 10/3. And there we go. Again, don't go to decimals, don't go to mixed numbers. All right. Write the ratio as a ratio of whole numbers using fractional notation. So now we have some units. So we have 26 hours to 39 hours. And so how do you set that up? Well, ratio is a fraction. So 26 is going to go on top. What about the hours? All right. Well, it turns out that if you have hours in the top and hours in the bottom, those divide out just like if you had 2 divided by 2, 3 divided by 3. If you have x divided by x, those all divide to 1. It works the same with units. So hours divided by hours cancels out to 1, so you're just left with the 26/39. So is that simplified? Well, one of them's even, one of them's not. When in doubt, go to your calculator. And 26/39 does simplify down to 2/3. And where we get in 2/3, well, it turns out that 26 is 2 times 13, and 39 is 3 times 13. So that's where, if like you would talk about those prime numbers, what I would have done there without the calculator is I would have done the factor tree for 26. I known it was even, so I would have divided it by 2 and then found the 13. For the 39, it's not even, but when divided by 2, then you would, or sorry, divided by 3, then you find the 13, and then you find that common factor of 13 that you can divide out. That's what some of the initial problems are. It's just like some basic definitions and like setting up like half of your proportion. So that's why we're doing ratios, is ratios are 1/2 of your problem. Question number 9 is messier than I initially intended. So when you see that, the question has been removed by instructor, you got full credit for it. Don't worry about it. Just move on. It was messier than I intended. All right. And so here's a couple more setups, and these are leading into the word problems. And so, we haven't done a lot of word problems so far. As we get deeper in the semester, like everything's a word problem. But when it comes to proportions, paying attention to the units is extremely important. That's going to help you set up your proportions correctly. And so again, this would be like one side of a proportion. So if you have 596 and 8 servings, well, we've now discussed that the 596 is going to go on top, the 8 is going to go on bottom, but don't just look at the numbers. You got to look at the units as well. So what's actually on top is 596 calories, and at the bottom is 8 servings. So the correct way to set this up would be 596 calories and then 8 servings on bottom. So you need calories on top, servings on bottom. Okay. That is key for these word problems we're about ready to do. So pay attention to your units in these word problems. Okay, so speaking of word problems, let's go back to the handout. Okay, so number 33. It takes Winnie 14 minutes to type and spell check 10 pages of a manuscript. Find how long it takes for her to type and spell 55 pages. round the answers to the nearest whole number as necessary. So when it comes to decimal answers, I said, earlier I said, always take as a fraction or, don't go to decimals, don't go to mixed numbers. In word problems, watch the instructions. Sometimes they want decimal answers for word problems. It depends on what the instructions are in math lab, and we'll bring that up. All right, so before we can do this, we need to be able to set up the problem. Now, on the test, we may not say specifically use a proportion to solve the problem, but just know that you're going to be solving equations, then you're going to have proportions to solve. Then the next word problem you get on the test is going to be a proportion word problem. So that's going to kind of go in order come test time. All right, so to set this up, it says use proportion, so that means we're going to have a fraction equals a fraction. The question is, what are the fractions? Yeah. So you may just very often what students do is just jump into the numbers. And so you see that 14 first and that 10 second. So if you're thinking 14 goes on top, 10 goes on bottom, that's the common setup. But then the problem is, what do you do for that second fraction? So this is where for word problems, please slow down and pay attention to the units. So what units are we using? Well, that's 14 minutes and 10 pages, right? So when we're setting this up, what goes on top, what goes on bottom? Well, it turns out like the first fraction, you can't really mess up. It's the second fraction that's important, right? So what I would look at is minutes is first, pages is second. So I would say minutes is first, on top, pages is going to be on bottom. So same thing over here. We're going to do, so if we have minutes on top here, minutes has to be top of here, and then pages is going to have to be on the bottom. All right. So what do we do with that first fraction? Well, it's 14 minutes to 10 pages. So 14 minutes, 10 pages. What do we do for the second fraction? Okay. Find out how long it takes for her to type and spell check 55 pages. So that 55, does it go on top or bottom? Well, if you've written the units, that's 55 pages. So that takes the guesswork out of it. That 55 has to go on bottom. Now, what goes on top? Well, do we know the minutes for 55 pages? No, that's what we're trying to find. It says find out how long. So we don't know the minutes, so that is going to be our X. All right, so now we've got the proportions set up. Now what do we do? Well, this is a proportion, so now we're just doing the cross product. Now, when you're doing the cross product, do we need the units? No. So the units are there to make sure we get this set up correctly. Once you do that, then you can kind of ignore them and just deal with the numbers. Okay, for our cross product. All right, so we got 14 times 55 equals 10 times X. Okay, and so now we're right back to standard equations on it. All right, so 14 times 55 is 770. 10x. And then as always, we get done this step over and over again, 10 times x, so we divide both sides by 10. So 777 equals x. And it's 77 minutes, which in math lab, that minutes would be outside the answer box. All right. So pay attention to the units. Now here's a question for you. Did we have to set it up this way? Could we have flipped it? Well, let's see what happens if we flipped it upside down. So what if we said 10 pages over 14 minutes? Well, what would the other side be? Well, we need pages on top, minutes on bottom, and we know that there are 55 pages and we don't know the minutes. So is this going to work? Well, the answer to that question is look at the cross product. So if you do the cross product, you get 10 times x equals 14 times 55, which is exactly the same cross product that we had before. 14 times 55, 10 times x. So we're going to get the same exact answer. So it doesn't matter on that first fraction, basically, however you set up that first fraction is fine. It's the second fraction that's the problem. So those are both good. That's a perfectly valid setup. But what if we do it this way? What if we just do 14 over 10 equals 55 over x? So is that going to work? Well, again, look at the cross product. We have 14 times x equals 10 times 55. That is definitely not the same. Okay, so since we have a different cross product, that means we're going to get a different answer. That's why this is wrong. And why is this wrong? Well, that 14 is minutes, and that 55 is pages. So when you're setting up your proportion, top to top, side to side has to be the same. So if it's minutes over here, it's going to be minutes over here. Pages, etc. All right. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of those units. Yeah. So let's do one more of these, and then we'll look at the homework and see how that goes. So 34, the ratio of a basketball player's completed free throw attempts to attempted is 7 to 10. If she completes 35 free throws, find out how many free throws she attempted. Round to the nearest whole number if necessary. Okay. So again, what are the units? Don't start with the numbers, start with the units. All right, well, basketball players completed free throws to attempted free throws. And there's that, that word to, that's our fraction. So on top, let's do completed. And on the bottom, let's do attempted. So this is kind of what I do is I may not always write out, but I do it in my head, is what is on top, what is on bottom. Then I go back and look at the numbers. So the ratio of basketball players completed to attempted is 7 to 10. Well, what does that mean? Is, these are in the same order. So the completed is 7. So 7 goes on top. And then attempted is second, attempted 10 is second. So that gives us 7 tenths. Well, what's the rest of this problem? If she completed 35, find out how many free throws were attempted. Where does that 35 go? Well, this is where units are important. So completed 35, we said completed is on top for us. So that 35 has to go on top. We don't know the attempted, so that's what we're trying to find. So X goes on bottom. So that's why these units are important, because you need to know on this side, is it 35 over X or is it X over 35? And then from there, do your cross product. We get 7x equals 10 times 35. 7x equals 350. Divided by 7. And that comes out to 50. All right, and does that make sense? Well, they completed 35, attempted 50. So yeah, you're always going to complete fewer than you attempted unless you make 100%. You can't attempt fewer than you complete. All right, so that is proportion word problems. Let me look at so in the homework, there's kind of two versions of these word problems. All right, so here is my number 19. So the volume of blood in a person's body is proportional to the body weight. Person weighs 100 pounds, has approximately 3 quarts of blood. Estimate the number of quarts of blood in a person who weighs 110 pounds. So this one says complete the proportion where the ratios have volumes of blood in the numerators and body weights in the denominators. So in this particular problem, they want you to do the setup first. When it says do not simplify, they don't want x equals. They just want you to set up their proportion. And they are very specific on what they want in the numerator and denominator. So it says where the ratios have volumes of blood in the numerator. So in the top is the volume, and then the body weights are in the denominators. So estimate the number of quarts of blood. So it says we don't know the quarts of blood, so we don't know the volume. That's why X is in top. Now let's start with the first fraction, which in this case is on the right. We have a person weighs 110 pounds for approximately 3 quarts of blood. Now normally we would just put 100 pounds on top, 3 quarts on bottom, but is that what they are looking for? They want the volume in the numerator and the body weight in the denominator. So in this case, because of those instructions, they're telling you they want 100 pounds in the bottom and 3 quarts in the top. So watch those instructions. They are telling us specifically what they want in the top and the bottom. Okay. And so that is for that first piece of information, 100 pounds and 3 quarts of blood. Okay. Now estimate the number of quarts of blood. So we don't know the quarts of blood for a 110-pound person. So then 110 would be in the denominator. Okay. So on these word problems, if they're asking you to set it up, make sure that you read what they want top, what they want bottom. Okay. And now when you check, and when it says do not simplify, that means don't solve it. So you check answer. Then they're going to want you to solve it. So then you do your cross product and go from there. And then round to 2 decimal places as needed. So that's definitely going to be a decimal answer. That's 19. If we go to 20, again, they're wanting you to set it up. So, tail links are in the numerators, body links are in the denominators. So make sure as you're reading through the problem that you get that set up correctly. Now we go to 21, it says estimate the total number. Notice that there is no fraction. So in this case, they're not having us set it up. So you can set it up however you want. They just want, the answer. They don't want the setup, they want the final answer. Okay, so that is what we're doing for portions. Portions are a useful topic. We're going to see them again in various places. So like I said, this is the third topic in the 6.2 section of the book. So there's a lot going on in that section. And after this, we only have one other topic before the test, which is formulas, which will be our next video. All right, have a good day.